Yeah, recording it makes it a lot easier just to get
Yeah, it
words
does.
right and everything else. So that's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
So to kick us off, tell me your name, your title, and your company.
Right, my name is Dr. Paul Rushton, and I'm President and Chief Scientific Officer of LPC Naturals.
And tell me a little bit about your company and what you do.
Right, well, we're a startup company. So officially we formed on the 1st of January this year, 2021, in Clarence, New York. But we're actually spun out of a larger, very successful company called LPC, Lackawanna Products, which is a grain trading company. And what happened really was Lackawanna got involved in a set of biologicals, so biological control agents, they're called officially, which are sort of living organisms that help plants grow and do better in lots of different ways. And I joined Lackawanna, I think, in July 2020. And after about 3 or 4 months, we decided that this was such a good opportunity that we were going to spin a whole company out of it, a separate company. And so now we're completely separate since January the 1st. And we had a number of products which we already had. But the interesting part was that we immediately started working on new products and designing them ourselves from the ground up, specifically aimed at indoor growing and cannabis.
Awesome. So what you do is a little bit more on the technical side. So if you had to explain to somebody how your agents work from a 20,000-foot view, what would that sound like?
Or how we work. So I mean, basically, we design and sell products that are going to benefit people who are growing plants. We're fortunate because the fungus Bavaria bassiana, which our products are based on, seems to interact in a really nice, positive, beneficial way, a symbiosis with pretty much all plant species. We're fortunate that one of the good ones, one of the best, is cannabis. And so what we did is basically designed a set of products which are good for anyone who grows indoors, but specifically for cannabis, because there are some opportunities now in the state of New York and across the nation. It's a very good time to be involved in that. And also compared to other plant species where you can have a whole field, a whole acre of corn, you could have theoretically one cannabis plant that's worth the same as a whole acre of corn. So they're very valuable plants, which also means that it's an important place to be at in terms of business at the moment.
Absolutely. So I have dabbled in a little bit of indoor grow, and I definitely understand that cannabis in particular is kind of a finicky plant. It really requires some very specific care agents in terms of what's in the soil, what's in the light, and what's in the air. So how does your fungus assist cannabis in growing indoors in a way that makes it a little bit easier for people?
Well, it's amazing, really, because theoretically, some of the cannabis growers that we've talked to have been amongst the most experienced growers of plants, period. But what's interesting is, even with what they chose, you can improve upon it, and you can improve upon it to a noticeable degree. So what we're trying to do effectively is add an extra something to the list of things that people think about. So they think about, first of all, what am I going to grow? What's the genetic makeup of the plant that what I want to do, and so you choose something which is either high in CBD or THC or has a 1-to-1 ratio, whatever it might be. Then you're going to decide, well, am I going to grow in soil or in hydroponics? And if you're going to grow in soil, what type of soil am I going to grow? And then you're going to decide what type of lights you're going to use. Are you going to use LEDs or high pressure sodium lights, or what are you going to do with that? And then you're going to decide what type of nutrients you're going to use and so on. Now, what we're trying to do is to add an extra one to the end of that, which is what type of biological am I going to use? Because we get amazing results from a lot of our growers from using the the different type of biologicals that we produce. And we get increases in growth. We get increases in photosynthesis. We get increases in the levels of cannabinoids and the increase in the levels of terpenes. So basically increases in everything that we're growing for, the yield, the quality. And that's because of the symbiosis and the way in which the two parts of the symbiosis benefit, particularly obviously the plant. And when we first started, I was sort of convinced that what we'd see is that the inexperienced growers would see an increase in everything. But the most experienced growers, because they've optimized so many things, probably wouldn't see as much. But we've seen the exact opposite. And it seems like when you have people who are experienced and growing well, you add the Bavaria in, and it increases what you can do just with the things that you already had there. So we're, very excited because we think this is, this is the future, not just of indoor growing, but also outdoor growing and pretty much everything.
Interesting. Very interesting. I know in a lot of large scale grow environments, soil is kind of treated like this non-living medium through which nutrients are pumped. So does this fungus start to turn it into more of a living soil where nutrients can be given and exchanged?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the rhizosphere, so this is what is the rhizobiome is what it's called in science circles, is all of the living organisms that should be in the soil. And some of them are beneficial and some of them aren't. And so what we're trying to do is to increase the levels of beneficial organisms. Now, people have probably come up against things like mycorrhiza. And that's the most common one that you see. And you often buy soils in the stores when you go in that already has mycorrhiza in it. Now, mycorrhiza is good and it works, but it only interacts in the roots. The reason we think the Bavaria is so good is it's systemic. It's not just the roots, it's all the way up the stem and the vascular tissue and out into the leaves. And that means that the benefits are felt through the whole plant in a much greater way. We also have some data from wheat that shows in a side-by-side that Bavaria outperforms mycorrhiza. So I think that what's probably going to happen is one of the thrusts in the future, in the near future, is going to be a much more exact scientific way of working out how biologicals work together to get the best possible mixture. And it may be, for example, the best way is to have one biological in the root and another biological added to the leaves. We just don't know. There are some mixtures out there, but they're completely random. There's stuff thrown in that's not very well characterized. Sometimes it works relatively well, but I think we need some decent science to actually come in and look at the biologicals. And this is completely the other end of the way of doing it compared to what I was doing before. So before I came to LPC Naturals, I worked for a company in Buffalo and ran what I think was the first hemp biotech lab in the state of New York. And we used to grow plants and do biotech to try and improve one trait. But what we did with the soil is we bought nice soil and then we autoclaved it to make sure that it was absolutely nothing living in it whatsoever. And that's to make sure it didn't go nasty. But the whole point is, what I'm now doing is the complete opposite. We're adding a biological, adding a microorganism, a fungus, to the soil. And what's interesting is we would work so hard to try and improve one trait using biotech. This biological can improve multiple traits. So we're talking cannabinoids, terpenes, yield, photosynthesis, root mass, drought tolerance. It just does so many things, and all you have to do is add it. It's that simple. So it's sort of like crazy, really, that something this simple can make such a big difference. But the reason it does is the Bavaria is supposed to be there. It's supposed to be in the soil. And what's happened in a lot of places is people using chemicals like fungicides and so forth have killed off large parts of the rhizobiome, including the bits you need. So what we're doing in a very clever way is putting these things back in the soil, just the beneficial things. And that increases the levels of things that, levels of all things you're growing for that have been lost. So this is where it comes back to like a full circle, really.
Mm-hmm. That is really interesting, particularly because so much of the success of cannabis really depends on the soil that it's in and the health of the soil and how it is able to exchange with the plants.
That's right. And in fact, the funny thing about Bavaria as well is even if you grow it without soil in hydroponics, you can still get good results. You just have to add it to the roots and to the leaves and it will grow into it. And even under those circumstances where you're artificially just adding nutrients and water, it still works. There's still an interaction, which is a positive one, which is great.
That is interesting. Wow. Even in hydroponics, you don't even need the soil for that.
Yeah. So, a lot of the things that it does, it just needs the plant and some nutrients and some water. That's it. So if you spray it onto leaves of young plants, you'll see a difference. It's amazing.
So What got you into working with cannabis? What brought you here in your journey?
Well, it's a very strange journey, really. I mean, back in, I think, 2009, 2010, I met my wife when I was on the faculty at South Dakota State, and she said, you should be working cannabis. It's the next big thing. But at the time, trying to work with cannabis would have been the kiss of death if you were a faculty at university, because there was no federal funding. It was federally illegal, and it really was not even possible to grow hemp at the time. And I then moved on to Texas A&M and kept an eye on this. But then what happened is in 2015, I was given the opportunity to join a biotech company as the vice president for plant biotech. And what was interesting to me was, first of all, they were doing two things. One was tobacco with reduced levels of nicotine. And I've been working on that at the University of Virginia before, and that's why they wanted me. But what I was really interested in is the other thing they were doing was cannabis / hemp. And they were manipulating the levels of cannabinoids. And I thought this was a really good way of starting to become part of that industry. So I really joined the cannabis / hemp industry in about 2015. And then when I left that company right at the end of 2019, 2020, that's when the LPC Naturals thing started. And I was very keen to not just stay in the cannabis industry, but actually try and contribute something that really would make the needle move, something that was really interesting. And so that's really where we are now. We're sort of developing and starting to sell products which are, to a large extent, unlike others that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. In all of the grow assistance that I've seen, all of the ads, nobody really talks about soil health and creating more of a living soil for your plants.
That's right.
So you have a very technical science background. You worked with not hydroponics, excuse me. You worked with plants for a very long time on a
longer than I would care to admit.
So when you first started, did you think you were going to end up here, or what drove you to get into this field to begin with?
Well, I think I always thought I would just be a university professor or something like that. But when you get towards that sort of level, then you're looking around to see, when am I going to be 10 more years? And I think there was sort of a day when I sat down in my desk at Texas A&M and thought, I don't want to be here for the next 20 years doing the same thing. And it was around about the time I started talking to the company in Buffalo, and it just seemed that there were more opportunities moving forward. The cannabis industry was starting to take off. There was money and investors' money in it. At the same time as it was becoming increasingly difficult to get federal funding in a university setting. So rather than staying somewhere where it's going to get tougher and more boring, probably, it seemed to me that moving sideways might be a great idea. And there's more money involved, and I wouldn't have to teach and stuff. I get bored with teaching. So, that was one of those things you can do once or twice, but it gets a bit dull after a while. And so, all those things came together, and it took me a while to think about it, because it's a big change to go from academia to industry. Mm-hmm. But that's what I did. And the interesting thing is that I didn't really think about it at the time is, when I joined LPC Naturals, I still have a presence in academia. I have a USDA grant with a collaborator at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I'm hoping to keep those things going. So I still have some of that, which is exciting stuff going on as well, just to keep me excited in the evenings, really.
So you've been working with cannabis for a couple of years now in this capacity. And you have a very different perspective on the industry than a lot of other people I talk to, who are more on the side of talking about regulations and the finished product. So when you're looking at the industry, what is the most exciting thing to you right now?
Well, I actually think that one of the most exciting things is what we're doing, because, we're doing things with biologicals that no one else is really thinking of in the same way. So I think that's going to be something in the next 5 to 10 years that will become mainstream. If you talk to people in the produce areas, who go to greenhouses where they're growing produce under glass, then we take our products over there, and they'll say, oh yes, we've been using biologicals for 5 to 10 years. We're using mycorrhiza and trichoderma and things like that. And so you have a conversation with them, which is why our biological is at least as good as the others, maybe better. The conversation with cannabis growers, and even worse, row crop growers outdoors, is a completely different thing. It's like, what's a biological? Why am I supposed to be using it? So I think where the produce people are now is where the cannabis people will be relatively soon. And it'll be, oh yeah, I use this biological, rather than what's a biological. And I think that's going to be the way that that's going to move. And I think that's very exciting, because we're right at the beginning of that, and right at the sharp end, and trying to, establish our company just as this starts to happen, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as not only you get more companies doing this, but when you get people at home, the amateurs, the hobbyists who are starting to do this, you're really going to see a big shift in the conversation.
That's right. And I mean, our biggest sort of, not exactly problem, our biggest task at the moment is getting our message out to people so that they know about it. So this is really the thing. We've designed and made these new products, some of which are really exciting and different. They all do basically the same thing, but in different ways. And it's now a question of, well, we need everybody who's growing in their basement and everybody's growing commercially to know about this stuff. And that's where we are now. So that's what the hard work's for.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I hear very commonly when I'm talking to people in the cannabis industry is the amount of natural resources that indoor growing cannabis uses. A lot of electricity, a lot of water. Yeah. How does incorporating biologicals in this make it a little bit more of an efficient system?
Well, yes, it does, in the sense that if your yield goes up, your yield per unit of electricity is going to go down. It's going to do better, so it'll cost less per ounce to produce. So in that sense, yes. For the plants in the actual system, they're still going to need water, they're still going to need lights, and that's still going to be an input. There's not much you can do about that. If you go outdoors, the light's free, the water, depending, but you're literally at the mercy of the elements. So, if you have very expensive mother plants and things like that, you're going to need to grow them indoors in a place where they're safe and they can grow perfectly. So in reality, yes, it does help, because it increases yields. It increases yields of the material and yields of the cannabinoids and the terpenes and everything else. It also increases the root mass and all of those sort of things. So it does help. And certainly outdoors, anything that's a biological that takes the place of chemicals is an important step. So one of the things we're very proud of at LPC Naturals is we're part of the green movement, in the sense of the biologicals themselves that we sell, they only have to do as well, and they do not do much better than the chemicals that people have, or the neem oil, or whatever it is they're spraying, to be just as good and better. So one of the things that is particularly good is we are taking the place of forever chemicals, which means, first of all, it's safer. And secondly, it's the future, although it's sort of back to the future as well. I'll tell you why that is in a moment. Okay, so what it means is we are going forward in the right way to make the world safer. So you don't need to wear personal protective equipment to use our products and spray them on the leaves to get the symbiosis going. And in fact, we have what we call inoculation honey. So it's similar to the rooting gels, but it's not a rooting gel. So the reason this is particularly good is it's just literally organic honey and the spores of the fungus, the Bavaria. So two things about it. Firstly, because it doesn't actually have a synthetic hormone in to make the roots, it's not a biopesticide. Everything else that you buy in the stores, all the rooting things, are classed as biopesticides. Ours isn't. It's just a bioinoculant. The second thing is, and my colleague Nick Bianco does this as his party piece, he'll walk into a hydroponic store, open it, and take a piece and eat it, because it's safe. So that that puts us in a very different place, and I think that's just a tremendous place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a complete 180 from 20, 30 years ago, when we were spraying all our food down with these chemicals just to keep bugs off of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. So as you've watched the industry over the last couple of years, is there something going in a direction that you don't agree with or something that you think needs to change?
Well, it's worried me for some time that there is a huge reliance on CBD. Okay. Now, someone else asked me this question a little while ago, and asked me, well, what's the big change that you've seen, and is it good or bad? And I said, well, it's about half a mile's drive where my work is to the nearest Wegmans. And 2 years ago, there were no CBD stores. Now there's 3. Okay. And I think the problem is everybody has CBD. Everybody can grow CBD. About 95% of the people with licenses to grow hemp in the state of New York grow for CBD, and the price is going down. So that's not really sustainable. And I think the future will see it slightly differently. I think you'll see a much bigger reliance on the minor cannabinoids. And I think that's where the big change will be. CBG, CBC, those sort of things. And that's actually what I was working at in my previous job. There's ways of manipulating the pathway to increase those. So I think that's something that people should be doing. I'm surprised they're not. And then it would be like, you'd have a CBD SKU and then a CBG, a CBC, and various mixtures and so forth. And I think particularly for the medicinal area, people will say, oh yeah, CBD does so much more, and it doesn't. The reason that CBD is known to do more is because it's the most common. It's been used in the most trials. Actually, CBG and CBC could be just as good, if not better, at certain things. And you need a good source of those to be able to do those clinical trials and those various other experiments to try and sort that out. So as the medicinal side becomes more regulated and more like a drug industry thing, it's going to be very important to have those individual ones, find out what each one does, and then work out how you can make a nice mix of those to have, the sort of the effect of all these things together.
Very interesting. I've definitely heard some similar opinions along the lines of CBD being so easy to get your hands on now that it really isn't cost effective. And from a consumer standpoint, there's almost no regulations on it. So the product
That's right.
also varies crazy.
Yeah, it worries me that there's a scenario in the near future where 90% of people will stop growing hemp because the CBD is not worth growing for. And 90% of the small companies that are selling CBD products are driven out of business because of the new regulations that might come in federally. And I think that people have to see this coming and plan accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a big kind of hemp boom in the farming industry, and it really hasn't played out because other than CBD, there's not really good ways of mass producing it yet in terms of, clothing and fibers and such.
That's right. I mean, because there's 3 parts to the industry and the sort of hemp seed oil for food and the fiber, that part is very much agricultural commodity. And I think one of the things that would benefit from would be a whole hemp 2.0 set of varieties that had 0 cannabinoids, because then it's 0 THC, and then it would never test hot. And people in the supermarket looking at the hemp seed oil know that there can't be trace amounts of cannabinoids and THC. I think that would be a good thing to do. That was something else I was working on in my previous job. I think that's something that can be done, should be done, and the company should come and do it. And I think then obviously there's the middle part of the industry where I think minor cannabinoids, rare cannabinoids, mixtures of cannabinoids and terpenes, that's an awful lot to do there and become a mature industry. And then of course there's the recreational, which I think is a lot more mature. I think that the levels of THC and various other things in the recreational part of the industry are already high enough, and I think it's going to be less that needs to be done, but this is where the biologicals can come in.
Interesting. It's when you break it down into, recreational, agricultural, and these minor cannabinoids, you see that so much emphasis has been put on recreational and everything else has been kind of left to the wayside.
Yes, I think, it's a question of what's mature and what isn't, and what's going to happen. And you can see that the recreational, the varieties are good. The levels of THC is higher, and the various other things like terpenes. And you can see that although some, regulations are coming in and everything else, there isn't that much more to do. You're just going to have growers and people growing in their basement and so forth. The medicinal has quite a long way to go, and so does the agricultural. The agricultural shouldn't take as long, but you need things like facilities. You even need to, have the right way of actually harvesting. So I remember this little story for you that at my previous job, there was an institute, hemp institute in Poland, and their federal funding had gone, and they were trying to hawk around some of the varieties of hemp that they'd had for many years since before the Second World War. And they had a variety, I think it was called Gigantea or something like that, that was literally as tall as a house. And you see these photographs, and it was amazing. It was like, wonderful. You could grow this fiber. And then you sat down and thought, well, how on earth are you going to harvest that? It's like, so it looks wonderful. It sounds fantastic. Yeah, they had other varieties that were very good as well, but probably better. But the bigger wasn't necessarily better, and that's just a good example of you need the right type of equipment to be able to harvest it and to ret it if it's going to for fiber or whatever you want to do to press the oil. All of those things have to be done, and setting up for a new crop to be the next soybean isn't as easy as you think, because you need all of those things. Otherwise, the profit margins, if you have to drive it for a long, long way to give you processed, they'll just cut into, and then it's not the same. But I do think that hemp in many, many ways has huge potential. And for the growers in New York, I actually think that in the long term, hemp seed oil and maybe fiber are going to be more the sort of thing they're growing hemp for than CBD. I think that's just going to be a flash in the pan to an extent.
Gotcha. So you've been touching on this as we've spoken, but in 10 years, when you have a consumer who walks into a dispensary, what do you think they're going to be looking at?
Well, I think they're going to, if it's recreational, it won't be that much different. I think there'll probably be slightly better defined varieties where they really tell you what the levels of things are, and people know what does what in a rather more scientific way. So it won't be just a name. So if you went and got, I don't know, Gorilla Glue or something, you wouldn't have 5 different versions in different places around the country, 3 of which may be the same and 2 of which aren't. It'll actually be much more like that. I think the big differences will be in the medical side. I think that they will look much more like pharmaceuticals. I think that they will be defined. I think you'll have, instead of like, this has got CBD and other stuff in, it'll be like ibuprofen and aspirin and so forth. I think I'll say this is CBG, this is what CBG does. You would probably go in and have a personal talk and say, right, you really want 75% CBG and 25% CBC, no CBD, no THC, and that's what you need for your back, because you have a problem with your back. It's going to be something like that. So the medicinal is going to be much more like, personalized medicine, a lot more like a drug, and a lot more defined. And I think those are the two, obviously, that you'll get in a dispensary. The out in the field stuff is slightly different.
Gotcha. I love that you touched on the medicinal side of it and really becoming more personalized, because I think a big complement to that is all of the research that is happening right now on the endocannabinoid system and understanding exactly how that works in our bodies and how we can activate those receptors.
Exactly. And that's, I think, what it'll be an input based on receptor occupancy. Now, which receptors do you want to touch? What cannabinoids act on one or more? So you can then say, right, you've got 10 buttons, under push buttons 3, 5, and 6, which happens to be CBG, CBN, and CBC, say. And then that's the perfect one for you when you've just put your back out, or, we have certain type of pain, or if, as may be the case, it has antifungal activity, anti-cancer activity, which is out there but is only anecdotal and hasn't been shown. But something like that could theoretically help.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at this from the side of the industry that you look at it at, if somebody is coming to cannabis for the first time, they want to try it, they want to grow it, they really want to get immersed in this, what is the first thing that they need to familiarize themselves with?
Well, I would go and talk to people who know what they're doing. There's too much out there to know, so that you have just a vague inkling of what's going on. I would watch a few videos about how to do it, and then I would go to your local hydroponics store and actually talk to the people there. And then, we're lucky here because just up the road, down the road in Orchard Park, there's a medicinal place called Flowered Wellness, and they do a how to grow class every month or two. And it's designed for people who are growing for medicinal purposes, obviously recreational and everything else. It's not that expensive. We actually are going to sponsor the next one and give some of our products away at it. I think anything like that, and that may be relatively rare at the moment, but that's exactly the way to learn how to do things. And then you have a few people who you can contact. I would also join some of the Facebook groups and so forth, where you can ask questions and so on, because some of them are very much, down to your own thing. I've grown stuff in our grow tents in the biotech lab and seen a difference between one end and another when we had two different lights, so that it can be very, very different depending on just tiny little things. So that's what I would do. And the other thing, for example, if we're talking local here, I know that there's a course about to start at Erie Community College, to do with cannabis. They won't have any growing actually there, but they are going to have a lot of information that's useful. And also they're hoping to put a business course, cannabis business thing as a bolt-on. And that would be very useful depending on what you need to know and what your plans are in the business. If it's much more of a business thing, that's the sort of thing to do, because information is important.
That's awesome. I love that the community college has already added a class on it. I think that's great.
And it's great, people want to do it. They see it as an opportunity for the future, so why not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to wrap your mind around when you're getting started.
Yeah. And there's clever ways of doing things in this industry. So, for example, the Erie Community College are going to be teaching, but they're not growing anything. And that means that they don't have any problems with things. I mean, we have a hemp license here at work, and I had one at my old place. So we could grow CBD hemp and do things, like cloning and things like that there. Maybe that's something that we'll offer to them and so on. But it keeps it simple. Now, back in the day, when, for example, it was still not even exactly federally legal to grow hemp, CBD hemp. It sort of was, but it was grey area. I think it was the 2016 Farm Bill. There were problems getting seeds across state lines. Then they became better in the Farm Bill that followed that, which was 2018, I think. There are ways in which you could probably try and get around that, but it's tricky. It's not easy. And those sort of things you have to take into account as well when you're trying to teach. So, or even sell within the business. So what I liked was that Scott's Miracle Grow became active in the area, and in a big way. But they had a really clever business model, because what they did is they bought up companies like General Hydroponics and some of the hydroponics ones. So they basically bought the companies up that supplied other people to grow. So they didn't grow themselves. And because there's some plausible deniability that everybody's growing tomatoes in their basement, it meant that there was no problem about actually being very active in the cannabis market without ever having to actually touch a cannabis plant. And that's sort of one of the things that's good about our business, is the biologicals are applicable to everything. We have quite a few people who grow things in their basement, but they use it in their gardens as well. So there's no problem about this can only be used for something that's not federally legal. You can take these products and use them for anything, really. So it's again, we're not growing plants, but we're supplying what we think are the best biologicals to people to grow plants, and that makes it easier for us with regulations and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, somebody could buy your product and just really level up their home produce garden or their herb garden.
Well, exactly. I mean, some of the best results that we've had have come from the garden factory over in Rochester. And they've used it on a few things. And so, we've been very pleased with some of the data they've given us from that. And what's really interesting, I suppose, with our biologicals, and I bore the guys at work with this, is we are probably active or potentially active in maybe as many as $10 billion industries. And I'll tell you why, okay? Because in the cannabis field, there's three. So there's the recreational, the medicinal, and then the agricultural, with the hemp seed oil and the fiber. We are also potentially active in produce. We're also already active in row crops. So this could be wheat, it could be corn, which it works particularly well on, but it can be grapes, for vineyards. We work with people who do hops for beer. So there's all of those as well. There's also We also have a product that we're devising, which should be ready by about the end of the year. We'll have to decide when we're going to launch it, which is actually for houseplants. So it's very similar. It has the Bavaria in it, which creates the natural and beneficial symbiosis, but it also has a little bit of soybean oil in it, which shines the leaves. So the moment you use it, your plants look better, and that's an immediate source of gratification. You also have, over time, your plant will become healthier and grow better and do all those other things, get bigger roots, but you won't see that immediately, but you will see a leaf shine immediately. And then there's a final one as well. We've had some good data from. I'll ask you a question here. What's the biggest irrigated plant species in terms of what people, in the country of the USA grow? What do they grow the most of? Grass, lawn, so turf grass. And we have some very nice data from turf grass. In fact, when I was at Texas A&M, I worked on turf grass. So it's like coming home again, but turf grass works very well as well. So, it's almost no boundaries. And, the cannabis hemp part of our business is only a small part of it, but it's a major thrust of what we're doing now. And that's really, I think, it's not going to be that every industry is treated equally. And this one is going to be one, I think, that's going to propel the company forward, hopefully very much, very quickly in the next, 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, absolutely. So through your president lens of the company, one of the core components I hear about again and again in a successful cannabis industry is inclusion, from women and people in marginalized communities to veterans formerly incarcerated. How does that fit into your company as you build it?
Well, it's definitely something that we have on our radar. Our parent company is particularly good at this. It has, people with disabilities and so on, and you can see it everywhere. With our company, well, there's only 3 of us really. And so at the moment, it's felt something to plan for. And we're definitely going to do that. It's important as well. I mean, talking to people in the cannabis dispensary areas moving forward in the state of New York, those type of things are very important when you're looking at, say, dispensary licenses and growers licenses in the industry moving forward. So that's definitely something which we will be doing. At the moment, we don't have enough employees yet to really, go at it in the way that we'd like to. When we reach, a dozen employees, then that's different. But at the moment, there's really just 3 of us who work on it on a day-to-day basis. So it's, it's a slightly different thing. We're at an early stage, to be able to give you any sort of like meaningful stories about that. But yes.
Yeah. And as you're looking towards the next year, 18 months, things are starting to move forward again in New York. Where do you see the most opportunity right now?
Well, I think in the state of New York, it's going to be recreational. There is a medicinal thing in place, although it's not great. There are people growing CBD hemp and stuff out in the field. I think it's going to be the obvious effects of actually bringing in legal recreational, so that you have dispensaries, you have indoor growing facilities, and people are going to hydro stores and buying materials to grow for themselves. When all of those things are in place, then it's going to be a very different environment. And, I think there are going to be some nice things that might happen, bars a bit like coffee shops, in Holland, that might open and actually have different types of things that you can go and smoke. There are obviously some potential problems with that, but it'd be nice to see if you could have that in the same way that have like a brew house or a wine bar. That would be nice, I think. But I think the recreational is the big change that's going to happen. I also think that there may be less people growing CBD hemp. So there might be actually less people growing outdoors for that, because, as we mentioned before, what you need for that part of the industry to become mature isn't quite there yet. So it may be a little bit of a boom and a bust, and then it becomes more mature. It's still at a very early stage.
So there's definitely a lot of opportunity right now on the agricultural side as well to develop these tools that are necessary to speed up the industrialization of that side.
I think so. I think the problem really with the agricultural is it's competing against things like soybean and other things like that. And the value of the end products largely are lower. If you look at the recreational, the end products are very highly valued, and the same to a decent extent with the medicinal. But the agricultural part is, I've seen people saying, hemp will be the next soybean. And it might be, but you've got to actually compete with soybean to do that. And that's a harder ask than trying to, make a variety for recreational that has either a little bit more THC or maybe some more terpenes, so it smells and tastes better. That's an easier one than the agricultural one.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting too as we finally get some varietals that are cultivars. I have a wine industry in my head. Cultivars
Yes.
that are more specific to New York and do well both indoors and outdoors here.
Well, that's right. I mean, I was involved with some of the first grows in the state, so the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we got some varieties from Oregon. And you might think it might be sort of similar, but it isn't. And so a lot of the hemp people, the very first question is, well, what grows here? And they seem to be very latitude specific. And you bring a load of varieties in from Canada, they don't do as well because they're not up in Canada. And so, that's one of the things that's important. But I do think there are some companies now that are breeding and producing varieties that should be good for most places.
Yeah, I love that you compared it to like a bar or like a wine shop where you can go in and taste things that are specific to your region grown locally. I think that's awesome.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's the way it needs to be for it to be fully recreational in the way that it should be. I think there's a whole lot more to be had out of it. I mean, when I was in Texas, I was, my wife and I were thinking, oh, let's open a bar where you can actually have a vertical farm next door, or you can actually see into it, like the brew houses have, and that you can see the big brewing vats. You can go into a place which is like a bar restaurant and you can see the vertical farm with all the lettuce and things growing. Well, there's no reason why you can't do the same sort of thing with cannabis. You can look in to see the grows and the things and so forth. And then you can actually choose what you want to smoke and choose what you want to eat and drink as well, and have that experience with all the different parts of the recreational thing. Now, that might be a bit of an ask with, various rules and regulations, but, you can see how that might be the best place to go in town.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly the best immersive experience.
Exactly. You can sit and watch, an afternoon's worth of college football and, do whatever you wanted to just to enjoy the experience.
Absolutely. So as you've been working in the cannabis industry for a couple of years now and you've branched out into this company, what is the thing that you are most proud of?
Oh, I think I think I'm most proud of is the fact that I sat down with my colleagues probably 9 months or so ago with a blank piece of paper saying, right, we think this is going to be good for the cannabis, industry. How are we going to make products for that? And we now have 3 products, one of which is a completely new product which no one's thought of before, that we've designed. We've come up with the names, we've come up with the brand, we've come up with the labels, we've come up with the concentrations, we've gone through the regulatory process, and they're now on the shelves in some of the hydro stores in the area and available on the webpage and so on. And we're starting to make the first sales. I think going from literally square one to having a range of products that work really well, that's something I hadn't done before. I never thought I'd ever do. And, my colleagues have done a great job as well. I mean, Chris Lent, our guys, has just designed these wonderful shiny labels that look fantastic and so on. So I think there's things I'm proud of in science, but in terms of the cannabis business, I'm very proud of that because we said we would try and, get into it and have products, and we have. And that's a great thing to have done.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a fantastic turnaround time for you guys. I mean, some ideas take more time to conceptualize.
Well, exactly. It was the most fun part was actually thinking of the names. We did that over a period of about a couple of months, and the name Prime Superior was good. We like the idea of superior, superior quality and everything else. We did come up with a couple of names or so that we couldn't use. So the way we got to superior was a rather bizarre way, because we were thinking of what somebody told me in one of the hydro stores. He said there's no products specifically for mother plants. So thinking back to my Beatles White Album, I was thinking, Mother Superior. So that was originally what we were thinking of a product for a mother plant. Then we decided that people would probably get upset if we called it Mother Superior, but we liked the superior part. And that's how it became Prime Superior, and then the rest is history. So, that's the little story behind it.
That's awesome. And I mean, I can't get over what a turnaround time, less than a year, you guys are on the market and seeing success.
That's right. I mean, we're making our first sales. Now is probably the hard part. Now is the, marketing, getting the message out and so forth. But I'm very proud of the fact that we actually managed to get the products done and ready in such a short space of time. It's probably It's probably closer to 6 months and 9 months, I think.
Awesome. So my last question for you today is something that I just like to ask everybody. What is your favorite fun fact about cannabis?
Oh, my favorite fun fact, and actually I had to think about this, but it's when I first came to the States, I went to the University of Virginia, okay? And the University of Virginia is Thomas Jefferson's university. So basically it was his retirement project after he was president. And he used to, he used to be up in Monticello with a big telescope and look at the building the university down in the valley. Well, what I like is the fact that Thomas Jefferson grew cannabis, and that some of the best quotes about how good cannabis hemp is and how important it is came from him, about the first importance to the nation. Now, he was talking about fiber. He was talking about the fact he needed cordage for the Navy and stuff like that, but he also grew it in his own garden and so forth. So I like the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a big proponent of cannabis.
That is awesome. You really can't get more American than that kind of endorsement.
Well, apparently George Washington grew it as well, but Thomas Jefferson is the one that has the good quote.
So we're really just coming back to this, what our founding fathers intended.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is, one of my collaborators over the years, and one of our collaborators who's on our scientific advisory board, is Professor Mike Timko at the University of Virginia. And so he was the person who I was involved with when we brought the first crop into Virginia. And swinging it past the university, it was nice to have a quote or two from Thomas Jefferson saying how important it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I bet. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
That's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it.